Hello, and thank you for watching this brief introduction to ISO. In this video, I will introduce you to the importance of ISO to your outdoor photography. The questions I will answer are, what is ISO? What does ISO do for your camera? What is a typical ISO range found on a camera? What the various ISOs can do for your image? And how an incorrect ISO might harm your image. What is ISO? To start with, ISO is an acronym for the International Organization for Standardization. What does knowing this do for your photography? Not much. There is, however, a long history of how ISO was developed, but we will not get into that here. In short, when photography was being developed, artists needed a way to standardize language, materials, and practices in order to predict the outcome of their image making. They needed reliability in the process to better replicate results. Standardization. Now the word ISO is so ubiquitous with photography that even non-photographers might offer a good guess as to what it is and does. Photographic film was first developed in the late 1800s. ISO was used to express the size of light-sensitive grains used to create photographic films. These grains were essentially glued onto film, and their job was to react to light. Lower ISO numbers mean that smaller light-sensitive grain is present on a given piece of film. As the number increases, the size of the grain increases as well. 90 years later, the same number system and range is used, only with digital cameras, it represents something altogether different. When digital photography was first created in 1975, ISO could no longer represent the size of grain on film. There is no grain. For digital cameras, ISO is the measure of how sensitive your camera is to light. Electricity flows from our camera's battery to and through the camera's image sensor. As we raise our ISO, we increase the electricity surging through that sensor, thus making the sensor more responsive to light. In a sense, each pixel becomes more hungry for light and eats it more quickly. Each camera might display ISO settings differently, but all use the same basic number range, 100 to 6400. However, different camera brands and different price levels of cameras will offer expanded or a more comprehensive offering of ISO range. On these two Canon cameras, you can see how ISO is displayed and controlled. ISO 100 to 6400 is fairly standard as a starting range for a camera's ISO. Expanded low ISO range might include ISO 50. An expanded high ISO range might go as high as ISO 25600. Learn and remember what range your camera offers. You now know what ISO is and how it is measured. But what does knowing these things mean for the quality of your images? I will touch on how ISO is used as a tool to create the right exposure, ISO's use in controlling speed, meaning the sense of motion in your image, and the effect of too high of an ISO and noise, or unwanted messiness in your image. The exposure triangle is used to consider the three elements of photographic exposure, or how much light is in your photograph. Aperture controls the quantity of light, shutter speed controls the amount of time taken to create an image, and ISO is how sensitive the camera is to light. As mentioned earlier, the higher the ISO, the more sensitive your camera is to light. Aperture and shutter speed will be discussed more in depth in future videos. The balancing of these three elements is too big a topic to discuss here. Join me in one of my classes outside, in person, for a more in-depth practice and understanding of exposure. As for controlling the sense of motion in your image, ISO does not work alone. Along with shutter speed, ISO can be used to stop all movement or allow motion to pass through your image. Very high ISOs allow for higher shutter speeds, meaning you can take faster photos and stop all of the movement and action. For this image, an ISO of 1600 was used. Lower ISOs do not allow for very fast shutter speeds. In fact, certain ISOs might limit you to take only very slow photos, meaning it takes more time to create an image. For this image, an ISO of 100 was used. Side note, here's my plug for using a tripod. You might consider using a tripod. I digress. In these two shots, you can see that the overall exposure is very similar, which is to say, the balance of light and dark looks similar in both images. For the left image, an ISO of 6400 was used, allowing the camera to use a shutter speed of 1/8,000th of a second. The image on the right was created using an ISO of 100, which meant I could use a shutter speed of 1/25th of a second. A much slower shutter speed means the spray from the waves was allowed to move through the image and appears softer and wispier. Wispier. I like that word. Wispier. A word of caution. A higher ISO is not always better. Consider this. The more ISO you add to your camera, the more electricity coursing through its circuitry. Think of it as more and more coffee, meaning more caffeine, meaning you are super energized, which is not always beneficial. The presence of noise will be the effect of your camera being overstimulated. Noise refers to any unwanted artifact left over from all that electricity. When creating images with lower ISOs, noise becomes less of a consideration and often is not present at all. This helps to create sharp, crisp, and color-rich photos that are truer to the actual scene. However, with slower shutter speeds, the need for a tripod increases, or your shaking hands will negate any sharpness you gain from using a lower ISO. Here is a side-by-side example of noise. The image on the left was created with an ISO of 100. The colors look natural, and there is detail and contrast throughout. The image on the right was created using an ISO of 25,600. Notice how the black areas begin to appear red, the greens do not pop, and the overall scene is not as sharp or crisp, kind of dull. This is an example of color noise. Not all noise is the same. There are a few types of noise that might show up in your images. Before you think Hot Pixel is the new nightclub in town, let me say this is not a good thing. With a quick glance, this image seems pretty clean and sharp. It certainly is not. The first observation is that the black at the bottom and sides is not very dark. It's kind of muddy looking. When we zoom in, we can begin to see why it looks that way. At ISO 6400, the image sensor was so active that some of its pixels stop working. They literally spark out and create standing colors. Most common are red and blue. The left image begins to show hot pixels. As we zoom in further, we can really see the issue and how it affects image quality. Don't worry, hot pixels are not permanent and will rarely show up at lower ISOs, even after they appear when using higher ISOs. Random noise and banding noise are a few other types of noise you might encounter when using high ISOs. For the image on the left, an ISO of 50 was used for this midday image of Mount Hood. The lines are crisp, the blacks are rich, and the whites are bright. For the image on the right, ISO 5000 was used, giving the image an overall softer appearance with the black and white areas sliding towards looking gray. Actually kind of a cool image, but definitely highlights the difference you may get with different ISOs. Cool image or not, be careful and pay close attention when reviewing your images. There are very subtle lines, banding, beginning to form in this image. If a higher ISO is used, those lines might have ruined the image. If you did not see them, you'll have to watch the video again. Or, trust me, they are there, I promise. Putting it all together. There is no right or wrong answer to what is the correct ISO. There is no way to tell you, do this thing with this camera and this light and all will work out. It will vary with each setting and, frankly, your mood and what you want to convey with your image. Some basic questions to ask yourself are, is the scene very bright? If so, your camera likely does not require a high ISO. Is the scene dark? I try and use the lowest ISO number that will yield the result I am after, while monitoring the image for excessive noise. Do you want to freeze the action? A higher ISO will allow the camera to take faster photos. Do you want blur, or rather motion, to be carried through your image like a waterfall? Low ISOs on a cloudy day work best. Does the ISO you have chosen balance with aperture and shutter speed? Always remember exposure. Is there noise? And if so, does it ruin the image you're trying to create? It will take time for you to understand what ISOs are available to you on your camera, and to understand how your camera will respond to higher ISOs. Enjoy the process and create images using a wide range of ISOs. Use the highest ISO available, not in the middle of a bright cloudless day, and observe when your camera starts to create excessive noise. And lastly, practice on the subjects you typically photograph. Build a community of fellow photographers and always be open to ideas and feedback. Real-time feedback from a professional can help you learn when to adjust your settings or when to stay true to your mind's eye. Thank you for watching. For a schedule of upcoming in-person classes, go to www.patrickaltophotography.com to find a calendar full of outdoor photography classes taught at beautiful outdoor locations in the Portland, Oregon area and beyond. These include private sessions for 2 people or group classes for those who enjoy building community and learning from a professional alongside fellow outdoor photographers. Thank you again.